Hi everyone, Kumar Datatran here with another episode of our Agile Short series. And for this one, we're going to be switching gears a little bit. We're going to be interviewing someone that I think can add a lot of context and experience, not just to Agile, but his experience and the similarities that he was able to glean from a course that we did together, I think can really enlighten this audience. And so very specifically, I teach a coaching class, and Dr. Brett Mers, who is here with us today, attended that class, and we had some really interesting conversations about Agile and military training and military planning and military doctrine, really. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mers. Please introduce yourself, and then we'll get started.
All right. Well, Kumar, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come here today and discuss some of these topics. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Brett Mers. I am a retired military officer, used to jump out of airplanes for the Army, and then decided since I could land in them, I switched over to the Air Force. Spent about 22 years as a political affairs and intelligence officer. Did a lot of different things, spent a lot of time downrange, and I met Kumar a few weeks ago when I took a class from him. It's a very good class. And as he alluded to, we had some very good discussions about the ideas of planning and the similarities of operating in a military environment versus operating in a corporate environment. And it was all very enlightening, because when it all comes down to it, it seems like no matter where you go, humans are humans.
So let's delve into that, the humans are humans aspect of it. What do you suppose drives humans, people?
Well, we all ultimately, kind of Maslow's hierarchy, you've got to have that safety and security at the bottom, and then you need to get your belly full. And it's only after that can you begin to put any time and focus into what you might call the higher functions, or that self-actualization. When the saber-toothed tiger's running you down, you don't have a whole lot of time to plan ahead. Thankfully, over human history and development of technology, we've been able to amass enough resources as a species to be able to have some leisure time, not only for leisure as far as recreation goes, but leisure time to plan ahead and be able to mitigate some of the natural and even man-made circumstances that may challenge us in the future. It's essentially what planning is. And, a plan is just a way to try to control the future. Although ultimately, we all know the future, at least at this level of reality, seems a bit uncontrollable. The ability to try and to focus our energies and our objectives into that future is a hallmark of human nature, and it's a hallmark of our species. I mean, we have built cities, and we've reached the moon, and all of this has been done because we had focused, coherent planning at the base.
Right, and planning is such an important part of any endeavor. I think one of the things that we had such interesting discussions about, both during and certainly after the class, is the similarities in the approach to planning from an Agile standpoint and a military standpoint. Can you elaborate a little bit about those similarities?
Yeah, well, the similarities are probably actually more than even the differences. The hallmark of military planning was highlighted by General Dwight, then President Eisenhower, general at the time, when he famously said during and after the Normandy planning and for the invasion that the plan is nothing. The planning is everything. Yeah. As soon as you and I take the time to develop a plan, in other words, this is a coherent effort at what we're going to do, we have a baseline. Resources, time, organization, materials, etc. But by the time we have sat down and figured it out and wrote that plan down, it's outdated. So unless you can update that plan constantly, in the Air Force, the term we used from Boyd, fighter pilot in Korea, was the OODA Loop, the 4-letter OODA of observe, orient, decide, and act. I observe a situation, I orient myself to the challenges and opportunities, I make a decision amongst my available options, and I take an action. And as soon as I take an action, now I'm back to observing the now new situation. And if there's a quote unquote key to successful planning, it's to realize the plan is nothing. It's the planning process that keeps you ahead of the change curve, whether that change curve might get you shot on a battlefield or simply bankrupt in a boardroom.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It reminded me of when we had this conversation about the OODA Loop and how similar that is in both practice and execution to PDCA, plan, do, check, act. And you can see how similar these concepts are. The PDCA and the OODA Loop are very similar in principle, is that you orient yourself to something, you observe the situations, and you orient yourself to it, you decide what to do, and then you act on that. And of course, you're going to keep that repeating that cycle. It's not that you stop there. You act, and then you starts again.
We
you
call
observe,
it spinning
you
the
orient.
loop.
Sorry, that's why it's called a loop. Exactly.
Spinning the loop. And everything else being equal, if you and I are in a conflict and I get to make 10 or 100 decisions to every one you make, I win. I simply am more reactive, and I can stay farther ahead of that change curve, which is always coming, whether we're conscious of it or not.
I love the way you put that, Dr. Mers, and that if you're making 100 decisions to every decision, one decision I make, you're going to win. Can you elaborate on that? Why is it that 100 decisions beats one decision?
100 decisions beats one decision because I can get more into the granularity. I can understand the relationships between the variables, and I can adjust myself far more than you can. One of the big examples I remember from American history was in the late 19th century, the big industrial combines were the railroads. They had all the power. They really did. I mean, they had economic power, they had social power, they translated that into a great deal of political power. By mid-century, the 20th century, probably even earlier, they had lost much, if not most, of their dominant position based on one thing. They defined themselves as railroad companies, not transportation companies. And when the internal combustion engine came along, they didn't invest in engine technology. They didn't invest in automobiles. They didn't invest in any of that because they were railroad companies, not transportation companies. Right. Now, another sort of flip example of that along those same lines was General George S. Patton. At the time, I think it was Major Patton, and he was accompanying General John Pershing going into Mexico after the Rebel Pancho Villa. A unique thing about this patrol was this was the first time it was done with mechanized equipment. In other words, Army used trucks for the first time in Mexico in 1916, one of their major operations. Patton was brilliant enough to look ahead and see what the internal combustion engine was going to do, not only to ground warfare, but to air warfare. And he was able to position himself and his units and the U.S. military to take advantage of that technological change. And that was simply, a kind of a longer term strategic piece of observing what a new technology could possibly do for you.
Yeah, and I suppose you have the ability to nest OODA loops within other OODA loops. So you have sort of a longer term, which is more strategic. And then you have lots of little OODA loops that are more tactical, perhaps, in nature.
It's exactly it. And we have, just like you say, the strategic, operational, and tactical level. And all these plans are constantly spinning. It's like the cells in your body. You got 37 trillion cells, which comprise, a few dozen organs and systems. And then above that, there's us.
Yeah. It's interesting the way you put it, that it's sort of mimics the cellular structure where decision-making is distributed in the body. I mean, we don't know what our cells are doing, what decisions they're making. They're reacting to things that are going on around them. And of course, the superstructures, the organs, they do what they do without any consciousness on our part.
That's probably one of our health issues is we actually observe or set conditions for ourselves, and then we forget, but based on what we eat, based on the exercise we do or don't do, et cetera, we set conditions that those cells are operating under. Even though we consciously want to do things differently, we forgot. Yes. We put them in that observable situation, and we need to go back and change that to get their OODA loop spinning differently.
That's a good way to look at your own individual health. But I guess my point was more around the decision making that we entrust to the body systems. We don't do it even consciously. We just exist, assuming everything's well until we go see the doctor and our blood pressure is high or cholesterol is high, and that's a symptom of a larger problem. Mm-hmm. But I suspect that in military decision-making command structure, these systems are in place to allow for distributed decision-making so that the people that are closest to where the problem exists have the training and the knowledge of the plan to execute appropriately.
Correct. When I taught strategic theory at the Air Force Academy, I often told the cadets that if I woke up and had the complete answer to solve the war on terror I was teaching a few years ago, it wouldn't really be any good, because the time they got it and got out to the next war, it'd be worthless.
Yeah.
So rather than teach them what to think, we tried to teach them how to think.
Mm.
And that's, the Air Force uses a management or a leadership. They make a big distinction, which I've always appreciated, between leadership and management. You manage things and you lead people, because things don't care how you treat them. People do. It's one of the big differences. But we use a phrase called centralized control, decentralized execution. So we're going to sit here and everybody's going to come up with this big strategic plan, and it's going to go out and do great and wonderful things. But by the time I get it out on the ground, remember that OODA loop, things have changed, things have adjusted. And I can't tell you, sitting in the Pentagon or one of the combatant commands, what exactly is going to need to be done on a battlefield at X country at Y time. So I have to train the officers and the enlisted and all the people that go out and do that to think for themselves and think ahead and be able to react. So the objectives are controlled. The execution is decentralized to the lowest possible level.
That's a really good way to distinguish between the two, centralized command versus decentralized execution. I would say that in the corporate world, even if for companies that are truly agile and nimble and breathe and live agility in everything they do, I would say it's very similar to that approach. It's a sort of centralized decision-making on certain things, decentralized execution, because again, all the people in the company are running in the same direction. It's like all the vectors are pointed north. And so people are going to execute based on what they know the plan to be, but also responding to the events on the ground to be able to react appropriately to the changes that they see. However, at least in my experience, in most companies that are trying to adopt Agile, they're not very successful, in large part because they're not following this sort of nested loop philosophy where, I don't know how the layers that you talked about, strategic, operational, and something else. Tactical. I mean, it may be operating on some premise or some level of efficiency, but not always to the level of efficiency that they need to, which is why you see disruption, like the railroad company that believed they were a railway company, not a transportation company, or Netflix disrupting Blockbuster because Blockbuster was unwilling to embrace a new way to distribute movies to the public the way Netflix was doing, or countless other stories of disruption. So what I'm getting to is some of the things that you and I talked about, specifically red teaming, and how that injecting that into the planning process can help enlighten, I guess, or guide the people to make the planning decisions. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, the idea of red teaming isn't as nefarious as it might sound to some people. You build a security plan, and then, quite frankly, you pay some of your people to go out and break into the place. I mean, that's why you've heard stories of police actually paying criminals to help them figure out, how to defeat security systems. Because the best person that knows how to rob a bank is a professional bank robber. So you want the bank robber working for you. So the military spends a fair amount of time with that sort of an approach. And that's really just taking the opposite perspective. I mean, even on a personal level, you're having a discussion with a friend, or even if it's a contentious discussion with a friend or a family member, it always helps to the best of your ability if you can stop and try to see it from their perspective. And that's all this is doing. From this side of the wall, everything's secure and locked up tight. But as soon as I step outside and look, I can see a crack at the bottom of the foundation that I couldn't see from inside. That's what red teaming is simply taking the oppositional or the opposing point of view to help you better understand your own position.
Interesting. So how would this work, or how does this work in strategic planning?
In strategic planning, we come up with a myriad of technical and non-technical and organizational security protocols. And then, quite frankly, we will spend time trying to break those protocols. We will give people assigned responsibilities that, they may have been in the planning sessions for the security or other operations, or they might not have. Their job is to go out and defeat whatever the other team came up with. And at the end of the day, because we're all humans, that's the thing. We get up every morning and we're perfect and we know exactly what we're going to do. And at the end of the day, It never works out that way. Keeping that in mind is paramount to successful planning. That's why when I build that beautiful plan, the first thing I do is hand it to somebody next to me, because they can see, if you've ever taught or been a student and wrote a paper, if you ever wrote a paper and turned it in without having other people look at it, shame on you. Because I have been writing all my life, and I still will never file an article or write a paper that I'm going to submit for anything until at least 2 or 3 other people have taken a look at it.
Sure.
Because my thoughts are on that paper. And even if I go back sometimes and read them, I'll pick up errors that I made, but I won't pick up all of them because my mind is still flowing in that same logical or illogical pattern. So I hand it to somebody else and they read it and go, what in the world are you trying to say here? Same idea with red teaming. Brilliant plan. We've got our procedures, we've got our processes, we got our people, we got our organization, and then we give it to somebody else and go tear this apart. And they find holes we never knew existed. On a business level, that's just as applicable, because somebody on your team knows about some technology that's going to disrupt your market space in the next year. Somebody on your team realizes something about a program or a policy deep in your organization that's going to affect your plan negatively. Somebody fill in the blank. So you want those people to be empowered. You want those people to have a voice, and you want to hear that as the leader.
In Agile, planning is very much a collaborative effort. We have members of, call it leadership, members of management, and people that are actually doing the work that are involved to collaboratively plan the next cycle of work that they're going to commit to, based on some goal or some, goals that they're looking to achieve over the next quarter, the next year, whatever it might be. And together, these people will come up with a plan. Do you feel that the red teaming approach is inherently built into an Agile planning model, or is there a deficiency there?
Honestly, I think it's a little bit of both. I think the concepts that are there. I think a little better focus, a little better structure could probably bring it out to more effectively, because a lot of people don't really understand or think, maybe understand the importance. Everybody looks at collaboration as finding agreement, and that's not necessarily the case. Collaboration is that everybody has a voice. And just as an aside, people outside the military see it as being very hierarchical and very directive. And there's definitely a side to that. However, when you're in it, you understand the military, especially the special ops communities, are the most collaborative organizations in the country, probably in the world. If for no other reason than everybody on that team knows any decision or any action taken by any one of them can get us all killed. So we want to make sure we all are on the same sheet of music. One of the big problems I've found in collaboration, which is occasionally you'll have this in the military, but it's fairly well understood. But in the corporate world, is you go into a meeting, what are you there for? Are you there to make a decision, or are you there to advise the decision maker? And you have a role. And in every meeting, there is or should be well designated a decision maker or makers, if it's a committee. But those people or that person has the responsibility for deciding what happens after the meeting.
Yes.
If that's the case, if we go into a meeting, Kumar, and you're the decision maker and I'm there, that de facto makes me an advisor. Responsibility is to give you the best advice I possibly can, relevant, timely, and accurate. And when I do that, my job is done. Now it's up to you to make the decision. And I don't lose sleep. I don't get upset. I don't feel, if my advice isn't followed, I don't feel like I was somehow lesser than, because my role was to make sure you, the decision maker, had the best information you could.
That's a really good point. And what I see is sorely lacking in the corporate world is that there are so many meetings, and these meetings lack purpose, design, intention, and no decisions are made. And so people that set the meeting up, they realize, well, we didn't make enough progress. And so what do? They set up another meeting so they can talk further about it and eventually reach a decision. And people go to these meetings because they feel like they have to, or there's a fear of missing out, because that's a corporate culture that if you don't show up, then you're not participating, or you're not as invested, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of what I have been teaching in my facilitation career, talking about the military doing for forever, is to have a very clear protocol for meetings that there needs to be a decision maker, there needs to be advisors, that people's roles in the meeting are clear. And so I find it just fascinating that we are not learning more from how military operates, in the corporate world.
Yeah, and you can kind of look at sort of Maslow's hierarchy again. The military operates more towards the bottom, where my safety and security is quite frankly threatened, sometimes directly. Business tends to operate more in that self-actualization level. It's not that it's not valuable. It's not that it's not important. It's just that if you fail to do your job today in the corporate world, you're unlikely going to die.
Yeah. Well,
and that's a good thing.
There's a different form of safety, though, in the corporate world that I think is really important as well. It's the psychological safety of individuals inside of that company, inside of the team, the division, the department, whatever it might be. Would you agree?
No, I would definitely agree. And that's why these principles that we're talking about are so applicable in the corporate world. My gut instinct is if you could actually get across to the corporate America how to do exactly what you said, is to organize and run an effective meeting, you'd probably add 20% to the GDP.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, I don't know this personally, but I've read the stories and I've talked to people that when Steve Jobs was around, when Apple was still fairly small, and they were before they had exploded, as Steve Jobs, he had very specific roles in a meeting, and everybody in the meeting was a DRI, a directly responsible individual, for one of the agenda items in the meeting. Somebody was always assigned to be the decision maker for that agenda item. And so if the group didn't reach consensus, and the DRI was the decision maker for it, and whatever they said, the protocol was, whoever the DRI was, if consensus wasn't reached, the DRI makes the call and everyone accepts it.
Yep.
And so
there's nothing in the military, from who and when we're going to bomb something down to who's going to make sure the lights are turned off and toilet paper is ordered for the building, that doesn't have a belly button attached to it. Literally, we all want to make sure all this stuff gets done, but there is some person who is directly responsible for that task or that task set. And so they're the ones that are kind of, I guess we use the terms a lot, and supported. So if I'm the commander running the operation and you're providing some piece of support, then I'm making the calls and you're giving me what I need. And sometimes it shifts and you're the one in charge and I'm supporting you. But we all are very clear on who's doing and who's supporting who is doing.
That's a really, I think we can, like I said, even I'm saying it now, and I said it before when we met in that class, there's a lot that we can learn from the way that the military operates and the way decisions are made and the way the command structure is designed and how strategy and operationally and tactically the military operates. It's interesting, though, to me that a lot of DoD clients are using Agile for their work. So, they're building a new warfighter, then building a new something. And a lot of the DoD divisions are using Agile methods. Can you comment on that, or do you know much about that? Or
I have a little bit of experience, but when we were doing the class we were referring to earlier, I can see immediately and intricately why that is so, because Agile uses the same sorts of principles, the same sort of responsibility, the same sort of lines of control, the same sort of planning and organization that the military is used to. So it might be a little bit of a different terminology. And that's the thing. English has 1.5 million words at last count. So there's always a way to say it a different way. And you wonder why that is. But the reason that is because there's always a nuance based on time, space, ethnicity, language structure, who knows, time of the year, that a little different word has the nuance that will actually connect with the people. And that's what communication is all about, is connecting. And so it's tweaking that frequency just a little bit. Agile does a very good job while maintaining the focus and the structure of the military planning model.
Yeah, I really like that response. And I do think that that's the case. If you look at the history, if you will, of management techniques over the 20th and 21st centuries, right? It was TQM, and then it was Lean Six Sigma, and then came along Agile. And if you look at the similarities between all of these different total quality management, Lean Six Sigma, which is still around, lean management, there are lots of similarities between all of them, right? But for whatever reason, some of these older ways of working, if you will, in the corporate world, they fell out of favor because something new came along. It described same structures or similar structures in a different way that appealed to that audience slightly better. It's like it resonated with people a little bit more.
Well, honestly, I think it probably has to do with the psychological background of human language development. Because if you take a group of 100 people that are all related to one another as a tribe, and you split them in half and put them in two disparate locations, and for 2 generations, they never connect with each other. When they come back, they'll have a big difficulty even talking to each other sometimes, because the mind has shifted and adjusted to the environment and the challenges around it. I mean, a very, very, very simple thing, even in English, the word let, L-E-T, if I'm going to let you do something, now today it means I give you permission to do something. In Elizabethan times, it meant the exact opposite. Wow. There's a verse in scripture where it talks about the Holy Spirit will let somebody. And what that means is the Holy Spirit will prevent somebody from doing something, not allow them to. So in a mere, in the same culture, in a mere 4 centuries, that word has completely shifted 180 degrees. Opposite. And I think we're all doing the same sorts of things, but the way we experience them shifts ever so minutely. And over time, that has to express itself in a little different set of phonemes.
That's very, very interesting and very insightful. So, Dr. Mers, one of the things that we left with, at least in our class, and of course we've talked about it here and there, is this sort of blending of combat and agile. It's specifically in the planning process. And you had a term for it. Would you care to share that here?
I think the word we came up with was combagile. So, and it has the idea of in combat, I don't have time to think, I have to react, which is what, martial arts training does. If you're standing on a street and you walk up and somebody draws back and you have to consciously think, oh, somebody's upset, he's pulled his fist back, by that time you're on the ground. Yeah. So you go through training before you ever get to that tactical level, that operational level. You plan it. I mean, a martial artist will go through that same punch 1,000 times. So when and if that situation ever presents itself, that punch happens. And I mean, it literally happens. And the puncher will many times not even realize what they've done until they've done it, because they programmed themselves. It's kind of like playing the piano. I'm a pianist. Yeah. And when I first started, I had to literally and consciously think about the placement of all 10 fingers and each finger, how it moved, which means I could get about 3 notes out every 15 seconds. Not really good for dancing. But at this point, I practiced it enough and enough and enough. Now I can sit down and play songs and have a conversation with somebody because I programmed my mind. And that's kind of what we're talking about with this planning, is using the terminology, the processes, so that, remember, it's not the plan, it's the planning. So when I have this plan and I walk out and suddenly there's a disruptive technology to hit the market I knew nothing about, and suddenly that $1 million investment I just made last month is on the verge of being worthless, I know how to get the right people, I know how to get the right processes, and I know how to pivot and adjust quickly to meet that market challenge. That's essentially what we're talking about.
That's beautiful. So Agile, or whatever we decide to call it, Dr. Murray, it sounds like it requires a lot of planning and commitment to the training, the regimen, if you will, right, that people must follow. And of course, the military being, there's a command structure, and they're the recruits, and they go through basic training, and they get trained on how to think, so that once they're out in the field, they can make decisions, because again, they don't have someone telling them what to do, but they know what to do because they've built the muscle memory to do those things. In the corporate world, we don't have that sort of commitment. So a lot of times Agile and methods like it fail because, there isn't that commitment. There isn't that commitment. You actually said it, the Maslow's theory of the bottom, the safety and security. In a corporate world, safety and security often is lacking. I mean, people have a job, yes, so there's a paycheck coming in, but that job is not that secure. People don't feel very secure in their work, and of course, the psychological safety limits their ability or their willingness to engage with their peers, and certainly not talk or speak their mind to their superiors. So to me, it takes a huge amount of commitment, whether it's agile or whatever we want to call it, to commit to this style of planning, and strategic planning and operational planning and execution, and of course the tactical parts of it. What am I trying to get at here? Not that it's a lost cause, but what would you say to an executive in a corporate environment trying to adopt these ways of working, whatever we call it, whatever the language becomes in 5 years from now? What would you say to them would be the biggest benefit in adopting this style of leadership and management?
Well, in this adopting this style, it makes you, quite frankly, effectively reactive, proactive, if you will. The biggest, you kind of mentioned it a little earlier, I was going to kind of touch base with this, what you just said. The biggest difference or challenge I've seen between how the military operates in its environment and the corporate world operates in its environment is the same challenge, and that's training. The military does a wonderful, fantastic job at training, and everybody is trained constantly from day one until literally the day you retire. You are never done training. And the corporate world understands that strategic, operational, and tactical fairly well. The strategic is the big picture. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to make a better widget and a profit. Okay, great. Whatever the goal, they define the goal. They have a mission statement. And then when it comes to the actual stuff on the ground, they know how to go out and sell. They know how to produce products. They know that part. Many times what they don't really understand well is the operations. And we call it operational art. And that's the linkage between what you want to do and what you're doing. And it's long-term. It's focused on training, organization, and equipment. A little command lesson for you here. If you didn't know it, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, everybody knows who they are. But most people in the country, civilians, don't know that Joint Chiefs of Staff don't really have operational authority. They don't command forces in the field. They are the heads of their services for training, organizing, and equipping. So the Air Force Chief of Staff is responsible for making sure everybody in blue has all the tools and training and resources they need to do their mission. And then when the time comes for them to go fly, fight, and win somewhere, some of those Air Force units will get chopped over to what's called a combatant command, Northcom, Southcom. You've heard the word CENTCOM in the news in the recent few years. Well, the CENTCOM commander isn't responsible for making sure the Air Force has beans, bullets, and Band-Aids. The Air Force Chief of Staff is. And that training, organizing, and equipping, that operational art, is the linkage between getting something done or wanting to do something and getting something done. Starting a fight is one thing. Keeping that fight going for a year is an entirely different thing. And operations is the link that makes that happen. And training is probably, if there is a key, training is the key to make it all function smooth.
Yeah, great insights, Dr. Merz. I think that's probably the biggest gap, if you will, in corporate environments, is how much the company invests in training their people. And a lot of times, especially in this globalized economy that we live in, a lot of the functions, the operational functions, are outsourced to other companies. Right? And I meant to mention this earlier in our conversation, where the military using agile techniques to do some work, build a warfighter, build a new plane, build a new ship, whatever it might be, or build some new tactical systems. And they're using outside firms, vendors to build this stuff. And certainly they're not trained in military doctrine. They don't understand how the military operates. And so I suspect that the military is using agile methods, or requesting that vendors use agile methods, so that they have a more reasonable chance of success. But that's a little off topic. But first, any thoughts on that? You think that may be part of it?
No, I think the agile model is eminently suitable and definitely attractive to a military mind, because they're used to that structure, that predictive model, and again that planning, because when you do a mission plan and then you throw it out. I think it was Chief of the German General Staff during World War I, Helmut von Moltke, that very famously said, "No plan survives first contact with the enemy." I mean, the Germans had a perfect plan to get to Paris, and somehow the French had a different one, and they adjusted. So,
yeah, interesting. Well, I'll finish my earlier thought, which was that companies, if you're either being disrupted or are struggling. Certainly we have a tough economic climate that we're in now. Think about the investments that you could have made, maybe can still make, and should make in the future to survive these times and maybe thrive in the future with a more aligned, more trained, well-trained staff that can think on their own and make the decisions at the right time. And so training, I agree with you, Dr. Mers, is such a critical component, and it's lifelong training. It's things that people need to be continually investing in, either themselves, for themselves, or for the teams that they manage.
And in the military, even in the last 20 years, they have training that you are required to go through to retire. They call it TAP, Transition Assistance Program. It's a training program. How to write a resume, how to put on a suit, how to find the right, how to find a job, et cetera, how to transition yourself into the civilian community, because you've been out of it a long time when you get ready to retire. It's amazing. All about the training.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, Dr. Mers, anything that we didn't talk about that I didn't ask that you'd like to share?
No, I think that was a pretty good summation of what we've been talking about, and hopefully, we will be able to spark some creative thinking, from people that look at this. And if I could leave you with anything, it's what we started off with: the plan is nothing, the planning is everything.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining us in this episode of our Agile Shorts. And for anyone that's watching, please leave comments. You can always reach us on our website, and I can certainly pass on the messages to Dr. Mers if you have questions. Also, we are working, just to let you know, on this Combagile idea. How do we combine elements of military planning with an agile way of working, if you will, and see where it goes. So more on that in the future. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.
Bye-bye.